Good morning. It's really good to be here. I was looking forward to coming again after last week. It's a little sooner than I was thinking, but that's all right. Jordan was going to be here. There's a misschedule there, and I can't make fun of him for that because I've done that at least twice, and I haven't been here as long as he has over at Santa Clara. Well, as you can see, we're going to be looking at, as was mentioned, the topic of fasting, and specifically some of the principles we can learn from this. It's true, there's not a whole lot of songs about fasting, and that makes sense. I'm not sure how exactly you'd sing of that very well. But that might also reflect that I don't think it's something we talk about a whole lot. I know that's true, at least for me. I grew up in the church, and I'd see, my parents fasted a couple times during my life. In church, I'd hear people talk about it like every once in a while. But it was never like a main thing, if that makes sense. It's interesting because Jesus talks about this a lot, and it's something we see happen in the Old Testament a lot. And like we just read in Matthew 16, Jesus doesn't say if you fast, he says when you fast. And so there's probably something important there for us to think about with this practice, even if it seems sort of old-timey or not very relevant today. And especially, we live in a society where we can get food really instantly, and we like to get what we want fast, and if we're hungry, we want our food quickly. And of course, there's nothing wrong with enjoying good food. We see people doing that all the time in the Bible as well. Even in Acts chapter 2, one of the signs we see that the church is doing so good is that Christians are meeting together and sharing food together. And all good and perfect things come from God. And that's true of food. We could debate if that's true of McDonald's food, I guess. But good things come from God. Food is from God. So it's not as though fasting is superior. We see people choose to fast at certain junctures or during certain times. And that's what I want to look at this morning with you. One last thing is, like I said, there's so many verses about fasting. We're not going to be able to look at all of them. This is just maybe to get the ball rolling, to put something out there for us to think about, make applications from some principles here. But specifically with things Jesus says about fasting, those can get deep really fast. And so we're just going to look at one or two of those. But the main passage I want to share this morning is looking at Isaiah chapter 58. You can go ahead and turn there if you want to follow along. Isaiah chapter 58. This morning we're going to start looking at verses 1 through 5. And this is Isaiah's critique of the false fasting the Israelites are using as they're trying to impress God. And we're going to look at that critique. Then we're going to follow the chapter as Isaiah tells them what God originally commanded concerning fasting and why it is the Israelites should have known God would be displeased with their false fasts. And after we investigate this chapter together, we'll try to hone in on some applications that we can take from this practice that God commanded his people. All right. Isaiah 58, verses 1 through 5. The prophet says, "Cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sin. Yet they seek me daily, and they delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness, and as if they were a nation that did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask me of my judgments. They delight to draw near to God. They say, "Why have we fasted and you don't see us? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it?" God says, "Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure, and you oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast that I choose? A day for a person to humble himself, to deprive himself of food? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast? Will you call this a day acceptable to the Lord?" And we'll stop there for now. So Isaiah he's using some sarcasm here. And the issue is, the people are fasting. And you see they're depriving themselves of food, they're throwing ashes on their heads, they're dressed in sackcloth. And they're doing all this. And they're asking Isaiah and they're asking God, why doesn't God see this? We're begging him to help us, we're humbling ourselves. Why isn't he listening to our prayers? But what did Isaiah say? He said in verses 4 through 5, you're doing the outside part right, but you're doing something else in addition to this. So you're doing the fasting right, but into verse 3 says, "In the day that you fast, you seek your own pleasure." And it's not even some innocent pleasure seeking. They're doing this by oppressing their workers. And verse 4 says, "You fast only to quarrel and to fight and strike each other wickedly." And so, of course, God says, if you fast like this, then I'm not going to hear your prayers. They're basically being like whitewashed tombs. That's the term Jesus would use later on in the New Testament. Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs when they were doing like all the appearances of God's command, but they had their hearts in a really messed up place. And here, they're even worse than the Pharisees, because they've convinced themselves they can use fasting as a kind of substitute. If we fast and if we wear sackcloth and all this, we can try to convince God to help us even while we break other commands, even while we abuse and hurt vulnerable people that we should be helping to protect instead. And so, of course, God isn't going to listen to them when they do this. In the second half of the chapter, Isaiah is going to clearly communicate what the true fast looks like. And it isn't just the appearance of fasting. It's not just the ritual itself, if you will. Isaiah says they should appreciate the deeper meaning that they have forgotten. So we're going to look at the second half here in a minute, but before we do that, I want to take a few minutes to look at what God originally commands concerning fasting, and why the Israelites should have known that fasting was not a substitute for God's other commands. It wasn't supposed to be a substitute, it was supposed to be a practice to strengthen devotion to God and to the rest of his laws. If an Israelite knows all the right ways to fast, then he certainly has no excuse to willfully forget God's other commands. And like Isaiah said, he knows not to oppress other people, not to fight, not to abuse. And I think we can go a step further than that, though, because if you look back at these original commands, we're going to find that even the practice of fasting, it's not just some strange ritual. It's something closely linked with God's other commands. It's a tool to help them in following those. So we're about to look at two kinds of fasting we see in the Bible. The most common type of fasting we see is, I don't think there's like a precise term, but we might call it spontaneous fasting. We see plenty of people in the New Testament and Old Testament do this. You think about Jonah, when he preaches to the Ninevites, he says, "Judgment is coming for you, yet Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. And the Ninevites respond to Jonah's message with prayer and fasting. In their case, the outside matches the inside. But they're humbling themselves, and this wasn't something planned, but when they hear Jonah's message, they spontaneously decide, okay, we need to really humble ourselves here. There's another minor prophet, Joel, and he tells how he preaches, hey, God is going to judge you if you don't turn back to him. And we read that the Judeans respond to Joel's message through fasting and through prayer. So it's very similar to the Ninevite case. On a sort of different note, you think about Acts chapter 14, we read really briefly that while Paul is passing through all these different churches, he and other Christians will pray and fast before appointing elders. So that's not like a specific date, but something sort of spontaneous. Here I am, this church needs elders, let's pray, and while we do that, let's fast as we make this important decision. And throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, there's also plenty of times where we read about people choosing to fast when they're confronted with some terrible situation that really wakes them up to their need for God. So when you think about this spontaneous fasting, it's really clear that this deprivation of food was meant to remind whoever did it that they were entirely dependent on God. It's a reminder that you need blessings from the one who gives you physical and spiritual sustenance. This practice of fasting was something you did to show God that you believe he's more important than even fundamental physical needs. That's why people are spontaneously fasting. They do it in conjunction with prayer very often, just to hyper-focus themselves on God. I know I need food, but not as much as I need God. So I'm going to cut that out of my life for right now so I can really focus on praying and seeking God's guidance. That's what we see people doing. The other kind of fasting we might call a designated fast. The Jews set other holy days up for fasting, but actually the only one mentioned in the Old Testament, the only set day where there's widespread fasting in the nation, is the Day of Atonement. And let's go ahead and, you can turn there if you want. I'm going to read in Leviticus 16, starting in verse 29. Leviticus 16:29. You can listen or follow along. God's been giving Moses a lot of commands in this chapter about fasting, and verse 29 to the end of the chapter is the summary. God says, "And it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves, and you shall do no work, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you. You shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. It's a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves. It's a statute forever." And then God goes on to describe the practices for the priest there. But look here. So Moses is mostly describing in this chapter rules for priests and the procedures for sacrifices on the Day of Atonement. But also on this special day that was held every 7 years, the common Israelite had commands to follow as well. And we just read those. The perpetual command for this day was that it was a Sabbath. It was a complete rest. The phrase humble yourselves or afflict yourselves, versions will usually say one of those two there in verse 29. That phrase means fasting. You're afflicting yourself by depriving yourself of food, or humbling yourself by depriving yourself of food. And this fasting was accompanied by prayer, because they're atoning for their sins. They're recognizing their intense need for God. And on this holy Jewish day, they did what other people spontaneously would do, which is to focus themselves on their need for God. We see that this was clearly an indication that whoever was doing this regarded his need to seek God as more pressing than his need to eat. And the refraining from work reflected the same sense of priority. It's God first. The promise God makes in verse 30 is that the Israelites are to believe, and if they do, then they enjoy fellowship with God. And it's very clear from this verse and similar statements that God promised forgiveness and cleansing to everyone who trusts that he could provide forgiveness, that he could provide for their needs. So again, I'll just say this parallel one more time. They're showing they trust God to provide for them physically. That's the other way around. They're showing they trust God to provide for their spiritual needs, for forgiveness, by showing they also trust him to provide for them physically, and that's a greater importance as well. I'm going to cut this out of my life for now so I can focus on what's most important, what God has really, really powerfully done for me in offering forgiveness. We should also probably notice the Sabbath is mentioned here. They rest, and we know the Sabbath was a command for rest from work. And it's right here in cooperation with this rest from eating, this fast. And the Sabbath command here is basically identical to the commands Moses gave for the weekly Sabbath. In Exodus 16:23, Moses instructed the people to bake or boil food on Friday for them to eat that evening, but also for the whole next day. And that's because they weren't permitted to do any kind of food preparation work on the Sabbath day. And that's also reflected in Exodus 35, verse 3, where Moses tells the people, don't even light a fire in your house on the Sabbath. And that's probably includes specifically sort of a cooking fire, though not just that. It's easy for us to just kind of gloss over this, but food preparation was a lot of work for them. And so God is commanding them to do that the day before so that they have more time opened up on the Sabbath. And it's not just so they can, relax and idly sit around. It really was a day of rest. During the week, again, people could easily spend a couple hours grinding grains or boiling meat and such things. Cooking took a lot longer for them because it took longer to reach those high temperatures with their fires, and they didn't have our powerful electronic appliances. And they certainly couldn't go to McDonald's or use Uber Eats or anything like that. If you're going to eat, it required some work, which is why Moses says, do this preparation the day before. So all that to say this, fasting, and even the Sabbath, which often went along with it, and the Sabbath that Isaiah mentions in Isaiah 58, verse 13, fasting and Sabbath are both tools that people ought to have known how to use. The issue in Isaiah 58 isn't fasting itself. They're doing all the outside parts of that fine. The problem is they're selfishly and cruelly doing horrible things while they're fasting. In contrast, it's clear God meant fasting to do the following things. He wanted it to be a time of rest from regular duties, And when you're resting, you use that to draw near to God through prayer, like we've mentioned several times. And the thing we're going to see Isaiah mentions in the last half of this chapter is you use your time of rest, the time you're free from your normal responsibilities, to help other people. And that's the most important thing in Isaiah chapter 58. And as we'll see, using rest to draw near to God and using rest to help other people, Isaiah's going to say those are really, really connected. And the horrible thing is, the Israelites, they should know that this is how fasting and the Sabbath are supposed to be used. But they've ignored God's commands, and so God has ignored them. He's ignored their false fastings, he's ignored their false prayers and Sabbaths. And with a reminder of what God said about fasting, let's go ahead and look at the second half of Isaiah 58. You can turn there, listen, or read with me. I'm going to start in verse 6 and read to the end of the chapter. Here's what Isaiah says about the true fast. Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. If you do this, then you will see light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you, the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer you. You will cry out to him, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, the speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be as the bright noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in the scorched places and make your bones strong. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters do not fail. Your ancient ruins will be rebuilt, and you will raise up foundations for many generations. You will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets for people to dwell in. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, doing your pleasure on my holy day, and if you call the Sabbath a delight instead, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going after your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. And then I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. God makes it crystal clear that the fast he wants is not some sort of substitute to replace his other commands. Rather, as we've discussed, it's meant to strengthen the child of God, to make them aware of God and his commands and what God wants his people to do. In verse 6, God says the fast that he chooses is to loose the bonds of wickedness. And he goes on to describe how his people are to undo oppression in this very dramatic way, to feed the hungry, to do good to people as God has done good to people. That's something God always commanded his people. Around the commands where fasting is mentioned, Moses also told the people repeatedly that the Israelites had a duty to protect the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, to do good to them and to provide for them, because God had done good to them when they were helpless slaves in Egypt. God says that when they do what he would do, verse 8, they'll be like the dawn. They're going to give off light like God is a light. It's a healing light for themselves and for the people around them. When they behave like God, God promises then he'll be with them. And he says in verse 9, you'll cry out, and then I'll say, here I am. If you fast with your heart and not just with the outside. And that's the whole issue. The people have been complaining from the beginning, God, why don't you hear us? We're doing everything right. It looks like we're fasting, so I'm pretty sure we're fasting. But they're missing the most important step, of course. And the issue is they need to actually do what God said. And they need to do that to a greater extent than they've been pretending. God says, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, if you satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then I'll bless you always. You won't be parched, you won't be scorched, and I will bless you. God's asking his people to present themselves to him as tools that he can use to heal people, to rebuild the things that are broken. That is, to repair broken and dejected people. That's the kind of fasting God wants his people to be busy with. And even I think Isaiah connects this to the Sabbath. When you have rest from what you normally are busy with, use that to be more like God. And that's what God is saying over and over through the prophet Isaiah. Certainly use prayer or fasting and even the Sabbath free time to pray, to dedicate yourself more fully to God. But Isaiah makes it clear that it's very appropriate to do good work on the Sabbath. And we might go so far as to say necessary to do that. Fasting was meant to strengthen resolve for God's commands, not to replace them. It was an invitation to make further sacrifices for other people, not an excuse for indulgence or for idleness. God didn't want his people to fear giving graciously and to extreme degree either. He promises, even in this chapter, that he will provide for people who are generous, because there's no scarcity with God. Also in this chapter, and maybe most importantly, God says, if you want God to draw near, you need to be a blessing to other people. That will show that you really appreciate God. And that's going to let you actually draw near to him in terms of a relationship, and not just someone to quickly fix your problems so you can turn back to how you were living before. To truly draw near to God, we need to reflect on and appreciate his heart. And that will always, the Bible makes this clear, that will always inspire us to be more generous and kind to those who are around us. Here's what Moses said about the fasting in the first place. This is in Exodus chapter 31, starting in verse 12. Tell the Israelites, surely you must keep my Sabbaths, for it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations. It's a sign that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So then you must keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who defiles it must surely be put to death. Indeed, if anyone does any work on it, that person will be cut off from among the people. 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day, that is the Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath day surely must be put to death. The Israelites must keep the Sabbath by observing the Sabbath throughout their generations. It is a perpetual covenant, a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. One of the reasons for the Sabbath command was that God worked creation in 6 days. And on the seventh day he rested. And he rested not because he was weary or because he wanted to lounge back and be idle. He rested because he wanted to spend time with his creation. And the Sabbath is sort of like the other side of the coin. In creation, we see God resting with his creation. And the Sabbath is his invitation for his people to rest with him. God recognizes that the rest of the week there's a necessity to work, to provide for yourself and for your family and for other people. But on the seventh day, you organize your life so that day is free. And as we've seen, Isaiah makes it crystal clear that when you have your regular duties set aside, you need to be busy with your Father's work. And that means prayer, certainly. But Isaiah says it means a whole lot of other things too. Isaiah says freedom is not an excuse for idleness. Even if you do fast, in conjunction with the Sabbath or not, he tells the Israelites, it needs to be done with a view toward being godly. Both these practices, again, practices that often go hand in hand, remind us of our dependence on God. And if we truly appreciate our dependence on God, then we'll do our best to extend his blessings to those who are around us. So if we truly appreciate what God's done for us, we're going to do what he said. That's how we draw near to God. And we, like I said, we don't need to fear being generous, because God's in control and he will provide, especially when we do what he told us to do. The fast was not a substitute like these people thought, but something to strengthen their faithfulness to God's other commands. And perhaps the most important thing, specifically in connection with the Sabbath, is that it's divine rest. God is telling the Israelites, when you rest on this day, it's not just a break to indulge yourself. It's not even close to that, actually. It's a day to reorient yourself and to focus and devote yourself to God. All right. In the last couple minutes here, we're going to look at some applications. Because you probably got something from that. But we're mostly just talking about God's commands toward the Israelites. And this is true. You've heard it before. All the 10 Commandments apply to us. And people will say, except the Sabbath. And that's true. That is a command. We're not called to observe that. However, the Sabbath principles, and those connect to fasting principles, those are very, very relevant, I think. Even if we don't observe the Sabbath, Romans 14 says, whatever you do, do it for God. In that chapter, Paul says, some people say one day is more holy than another. Some people say it doesn't matter. All days all days are the same before God. Paul says that's fine. Whatever you do, devote yourself to God. Probably no one will do this, but you could treat your Saturday very much like the Israelites were doing. There wouldn't be anything wrong with that. But God doesn't say you have to do that. The point is, remember Jesus said when you fast. When you decide to do this, do it for God. Don't make the Pharisees' mistake like they did in Matthew 16, doing it to impress people. And we see that's what they're doing in Isaiah 58 as well. Don't make that mistake, but whatever you do it for God. All days are alike, but we can take advantage of this tool. Here's one of the most important principles, I think. Fasting means a deprivation of food. That's just what the term means. But we've already seen the principle extends beyond just that. And you could say the Sabbath, in a way, is a fast from your regular work. I'll just summarize this. You can go look at this later. But in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul gives instructions to husbands and wives. And he tells them, wife, don't deprive your husband of your body, and husband, don't deprive your wife of your body. He says you both ought to serve each other. But he does say if you both agree, you can separate from physical intimacy for a time in order to devote yourselves more directly to God. So that's not a fast from food, right? But it is a fast where you're saying this isn't what we would normally do, but we're going to choose to do this now to dedicate ourselves more fully to God. And that can be a beautiful thing. And again, I was joking about McDonald's and Uber Eats a couple of times here. Fasting from food isn't a super big deal to us in the same way it was for the Israelites. For them, it could take hours to make the day's food. So that opened up a lot of time when they fasted and they abstained from work of food preparation. We can snap our fingers and get some food. So there's still some benefit, I think, to considering a straight-up fast of food. But I think 1 Corinthians 7 shows us the possibility of fasting from other things. You could brainstorm a lot of things, and probably the things you brainstorm might be good to put into practice, at least for a time. I know for me, it's been good for me to take breaks from video games, YouTube, even reading different books at times. Those things aren't bad, but when I make a conscious decision to take a step back from those, I have opened up a lot more time that I can use. And this requires foresight and really thinking about what you're doing with your time. I think that's probably one of the most important principles from these ideas. And along with that, here's the very last thought. I'm going to look here at Matthew 14. You can listen or turn over there. I'm going to start in verse 13, but the first part of Matthew 14 describes how Herod has finally killed the prophet John the Baptist, who is Jesus' cousin. And this is what Matthew 14:13 says. Now when Jesus heard this, when Jesus heard that his cousin had died, he withdrew from there into a boat to a desolate place by himself. I think the implication is, as with other times we've seen Jesus withdraw by himself, he's troubled in spirit. He wants to pray. And his cousin's just died. And also this forerunner to his ministry has died. That reminds him, I'm certain, that the cross is getting closer and closer, which is at least a little distressing to him. And so it's for this combination of reasons, Jesus goes away by himself to pray. But look what happens next. But when the crowds heard of it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. And then he'll go on to provide for all of them. I think Jesus is putting into practice what we see Isaiah telling the people in Isaiah chapter 58. He wanted to do something for him with his time, and it wasn't a bad thing. After he feeds the people, he will go away by himself and get that alone time with God that he desperately needed. But notice that he allows himself to be interrupted. He'd planned to use his time a certain way, but when he sees the crowds before him, when he sees the opportunity there, he has compassion. He sacrifices what he wanted to do to attend to these other people. And that's exactly what Isaiah 58 was talking about. Sacrifice your time, pour yourself out for others. And that's what Jesus does. He provides an astounding feast for these people because he's about to perform the miracle of feeding the 5,000. And he We have that in the Bible because he was willing to let his plans be interrupted. There's a Christian writer, probably you've heard of him, C.S. Lewis, and he reflects on this idea as well. He says the great thing for us to do is to stop regarding all unpleasant things as interruptions of our own real life. Because the truth is, of course, that what one calls interruptions are precisely one's real life. It's the life God is sending us day by day. It's really easy for us to sort of make idols out of our plans or out of different indulgences, different pleasant things that we enjoy. And every good and perfect thing comes from God. Food is good. Everything is good in its place. But we need to be willing to set those things aside when situation requires it. And when exactly that is up to you to decide on the specifics. But I would encourage you all to think about that. And that is the lesson this morning. God is a great provider. And if you haven't taken hold of the salvation that he's providing, then you would do really well to do that. We can help you through prayer, or if you need to make Jesus your Lord through baptism, you can come forward as we stand and sing this song.